August 28, 1944. 25,000 feet above Munich. The contrails hung thick and white in the thin blue sky as Captain Don Bryan of the 352nd Fighter Group adjusted the trim on his P-51 Mustang, scanning the airspace for bandits. The radio crackled with a warning from the lead bomber formation, jets. 3 o'clock low. Bryan's head snapped right. What he saw would become legend. Streaking through the bomber stream were 3 silver arrows, moving faster than anything he'd ever seen. Twin jet plumes glowing red against the clouds, no propellers, sleek swept-back wings. The formation of B-17s scattered like startled birds as the Messerschmitt Me 262s tore through the center, each armed with 430mm cannons that shredded metal like paper. A fortress exploded midair. Another rolled onto its back and dropped out of formation trailing smoke. The jets didn't stay. They flashed through, made one firing pass, then disappeared into the haze. Bryan firewalled the throttle and nosed down after them, but within seconds he knew it was hopeless. The gap widened with every heartbeat. He was diving at 450 miles per hour. The German jets were pulling away. He radioed the flight, "We're not catching them. Not in a dive, not even downhill." It was the first time American pilots realized they were now fighting a different kind of enemy. The Luftwaffe had entered the jet age. But the jet age had actually begun long before that terrifying encounter. Back in 1939, years before the first Mustang ever flew, engineers at Messerschmitt had already begun developing a revolutionary aircraft, one that wouldn't rely on pistons or propellers. Designed by Dr. Waldemar Voigt and powered by pioneering turbojet engines from BMW and Junkers, the Me-262 was conceived as a high-speed interceptor capable of flying 100 miles per hour faster than any Allied fighter. The first prototype took to the skies on April 18, 1941, powered by a piston engine due to delays in jet engine development, but it wasn't until July 18, 1942 that the aircraft made its first pure jet flight using twin Junkers Jumo 004 engines. Engineers and test pilots immediately grasped its potential. It was the future, sleek, deadly, and 150 miles per hour faster than the best the Allies had. But the future came wrapped in bureaucracy and delusion. Adolf Hitler, upon seeing the jet demonstrated in November 1943, was captivated not by its speed but by its potential as a bomber. Convinced that the war would be won or lost by pounding Allied armies on the ground, he insisted that the Me-262 be adapted as a Blitz Bomber, fast enough to evade fighters and carry 250 kg bombs. Engineers protested. The jet's design was already fragile. Its engines lasted barely 25 hours between overhauls. Adding bombs would compromise its center of gravity and airflow. But Hitler overruled them. It would be a bomber or nothing. The decision delayed full deployment by nearly a year. By the time the Me-262 began entering service in significant numbers in mid-1944, the Allies had already landed in Normandy, destroyed German oil refineries, and began systematic raids on jet airfields. Despite the delays, when the Me-262 finally reached combat squadrons like Jagdgeschwader 7, it immediately altered the balance of air power, at least on paper. With a top speed of 540 miles per hour, it could outrun any Allied fighter. Its 4 108 Malawian Quachars 30mm cannons could obliterate bombers with a single burst. On July 25, 1944, pilot Alfred Schreiber scored the first aerial victory in a jet fighter, shooting down a British Mosquito. But victory came with asterisks. The Me-262 required 3 times the maintenance of conventional fighters. Its engines were delicate, often catching fire if throttle inputs were too abrupt. The landing gear, designed under early war assumptions, was barely capable of supporting the aircraft's weight. More importantly, it was vulnerable during takeoff and landing, when it moved slowly and couldn't maneuver. Allied intelligence quickly realized this and began circling airfields with Mustang patrols, waiting to catch the jets when they were least able to fight back. This ambush strategy soon earned the nickname, rat catching. Pilots like Captain Chuck Yeager and Colonel Hubert Zemke organized squadrons to loiter above bases like Lechfeld and Neuburg, where Me-262s were known to operate. When a jet took off or came in for landing, the Mustangs pounced. P-51s couldn't match the jet's speed in flight, but they could outturn, outclimb at low altitudes, and overwhelm with superior numbers. The Luftwaffe responded by installing flak batteries and creating a defensive ring around the fields, but it wasn't enough. In one 2-week period in late September 1944, American fighters destroyed over a dozen Me-262s during takeoff or landing, many before the jets had even fired a shot in combat. The psychological effect on German pilots was devastating. Test pilot Hans Fey, who defected in March 1945 by flying a Me-262 to Allied lines, reported that pilots lived in constant fear of ambush. "We feared the Mustang more than the engine flames," he later said. "We took off knowing we might not return, not because of battle, but because of being hunted while climbing to safety. And the losses weren't just mechanical or tactical, they were human." The few pilots trained to fly the Me-262 were often pulled from elite squadrons. They had minimal hours on jets, no simulator time, and were asked to learn a completely new form of aerial warfare in days. Crashes were common. A single engine flame-out on takeoff often spelled death. Several aircraft were lost during test flights. Others simply vanished into the Alps during transfer flights. Still, when it worked, the Me-262 was a killer. On March 18, 1945, a formation of Me-262s attacked a bomber stream over Berlin, destroying 12 aircraft in less than 10 minutes. American crews described the experience as being attacked by ghosts, appearing out of nowhere, firing once, and vanishing into the clouds. But moments like these were rare. The Luftwaffe simply couldn't produce enough aircraft or train enough pilots. Fuel was scarce. Airfields were cratered. Every Me-262 that launched had to run a gauntlet of Allied airpower just to get airborne. Every sortie was a gamble. By the end of the war, 1,430 Me-262s had been built. Fewer than 300 saw combat. Most were destroyed on the ground. Others were abandoned at airfields as fuel ran out and pilots deserted. It was too little, too late. The jet that should have revolutionized warfare instead became a symbol of what might have been. Over the ruins of German airfields, P-51s cruised unchallenged, circling above silent runways littered with broken dreams and twisted jet turbines. There was no denying it now. The Me-262 wasn't just fast. It was a different species. When Allied intelligence first received reports of a jet-propelled German aircraft in 1943, most analysts dismissed it as experimental. Rumors had floated for years, but no reliable sightings. That changed by mid-1944. Photographs confirmed it. Radar tracked them. Debriefed bomber crews spoke of silver flashes in the sky, aircraft they couldn't see until it was too late. Even the Mustangs, with their bubble canopies and 440 miles per hour top speeds, couldn't keep up once a 262 hit full throttle. What the Allies were facing wasn't just a new plane, it was the beginning of the jet age. On paper, the Me-262 was unmatched. With its swept-back wings, streamlined fuselage, and dual Jumo 004B turbojets producing nearly 2,000 pounds of thrust each, it could reach speeds over 540 miles per hour. That made it nearly 100 miles per hour faster than a Mustang or Thunderbolt in level flight. And while Allied fighters relied on .50 caliber machine guns, the 262 was armed with 30 million Malawian Kwacha's 108 autocannons, capable of disintegrating a B-17 in a 2-second burst. That was no exaggeration. Gun camera footage from surviving Me-262 sorties showed entire bombers snapping apart midair, wings shorn off in flashes of flame and debris. No fighter in the sky could do that. Only this. But its true lethality came not from the weapons or speed alone, but how it exploited the chaos of modern air war. The Luftwaffe had learned that massed formations of bombers could be broken from the inside. And that's exactly how the Me-262 operated. It would approach high, from above or behind, and then drop into the bomber stream. One pass. One burst. Then gone. No dogfighting. No turning engagements. Just speed and firepower. The traditional rules of aerial combat were becoming obsolete. Yet for all its power, The Me-262 had fragile bones. The jet engines that made it revolutionary were also its greatest liability. The Jumo 004 engines were rushed into production, made from inferior alloys due to resource shortages, and prone to catastrophic failure. Throttle up too fast, flame out. Dive too steep, compressor stall. Early test pilots were warned never to make sudden power adjustments. Engine lifespan was measured not in months or even weeks, but hours. On average, they lasted between 20 and 25 hours before needing a complete rebuild. In the heat of combat, that meant they were disposable machines. The complexity didn't stop there. Landing the Me-262 was an art in itself. Its narrow main landing gear had a habit of collapsing on rough fields. Its high approach speed meant long runways were mandatory. And worst of all, it was nearly defenseless during takeoff and landing. At those moments, the Me-262 was just another aircraft, barely faster than a Bf-109, slow to maneuver, and unable to climb. Ground crews had to be lightning fast. Fueling, loading, and repairs all had to happen under constant threat of Mustang patrols circling above. One mistake, and the jet never made it off the tarmac. Even in the air, the 262's high speed created a new problem. Pilots had to retrain their reflexes. Everything happened faster. Targeting bombers required precise timing. Too fast, and you overshot your mark. Too slow, and you became a target. Aiming the heavy 30mm cannons wasn't like squeezing a trigger on a machine gun. Each round dropped quickly at range. German pilots learned to fire in short bursts, conserving both ammunition and barrel life. But hitting anything at 500 miles per hour required nerves of steel and perfect anticipation. There was another, more subtle consequence of that speed: isolation. Me-262 pilots often flew alone or in pairs. They couldn't maneuver as tightly as piston fighters. Formation flying was difficult. Communication was sparse. Some pilots reported feeling disconnected from the battle entirely. They would streak through a bomber formation, fire, and then be gone before anyone could react, including their own wingmen. It was effective, but lonely. Detached. The Me-262 wasn't just a new plane. It was a new philosophy. One built on hit-and-run strikes, not dogfights. One that favored ambushes, not duels. This shift also shook the morale of Allied aircrews. B-17 and B-24 crews had learned to watch the skies for German fighters. But the Me-262 gave no warning. There was no climb, no build-up, no dance before the kill. It simply appeared. By the time tail gunners opened fire, it was already breaking away. Some gunners refused to fire at all, believing the jets were impossible to hit. The psychological toll was immense. Veteran crews reported seeing their comrades disappear in midair, vaporized before they could even call out on the radio. The Blitz attack of the 262 became a symbol of sudden death. Still, not everyone was terrified. In some circles of the USAAF, the Me-262 sparked fascination. Pilots like Don Bryan and Chuck Yeager, though shocked by the jet's performance, began studying its weaknesses. The idea was simple: if you couldn't catch it in the sky, you'd have to get it where it couldn't run. That meant identifying airfields, tracking flight schedules, and developing entirely new aerial tactics. The Mustang wouldn't fight the jet on its terms. It would rewrite the rules. Meanwhile, inside the German high command, the 262 became a point of frustration. Hitler's insistence that it be used as a bomber meant critical months were lost. Crews had to be retrained. Bomb racks had to be tested, installed, then often removed. Several promising pilots were killed in accidents during training missions with overloaded aircraft. Resources were wasted. And in the meantime, the Allies tightened their grip. Fuel supplies were vanishing. Runways were bombed daily. And even the skilled pilots who made it to the air often found their victories hollow: one bomber down, 10 more behind it. Yet for all its logistical misery, the Me-262 did something profound. It made Allied commanders uncomfortable. It introduced doubt. What if the Germans built more? What if they swarmed the bomber streams with jets? What if the Mustang couldn't keep up next time? These questions echoed through RAF and USAF strategy meetings in late 1944. Engineers scrambled to accelerate their own jet programs. Propaganda films were rushed to reassure the public. And on the front lines, P-51 pilots began flying a little lower. A little slower. Watching the horizon for silver streaks. Because the war had changed. And everyone knew it. They called it Rat Week. It wasn't official, but that's what the pilots said over the radio, usually with a grim half-joke and tightened lips. By October 1944, the Allies had identified nearly every operational Me-262 base in Western Germany, Lechfeld, Neuburg, Rechlin, and Prague among them. Recon photos showed blast pens being built in frantic rows. Fuel trucks dotted the airfields like targets in a shooting gallery. Each base had a window, just a few precious minutes, when the jets were on the ground, engines warming up, or wheels just lifting off. That's when they were most vulnerable. And that's when the Mustang squadron started circling. The idea wasn't glamorous. It wasn't the kind of dogfighting glory pilots dreamed of. But it worked. P-51 groups would fly long ovals over suspected jet bases at medium altitude, just outside the range of flak. When a 262 was spotted, they dove fast, sometimes 4 or 5 Mustangs to a jet. The German pilot barely had time to retract his gear before the sky erupted in tracers. Some were shot before they could get their wheels off the ground. Others tried to outrun the Mustangs with cold engines, only to stall or veer off the runway into trees. The 262's speed advantage meant nothing at 180 knots. It became a game of timing and precision, not speed. One of the most effective of these hunters was Captain Chuck Yeager, already an ace by that point, with a reputation for reading the enemy before they ever appeared. In one famous encounter, Yeager and his flight were patrolling near Aachen when they spotted 2 Me-262s coming in for landing. He dove from altitude, pulling near transonic speeds in a screaming descent. One of the jets banked left, trying to evade, but it was too late. Yeager closed to 300 yards and opened fire. The 30mm armed Marvel exploded in midair, never having fired a single shot. It was over in seconds. The jet was fast, but the Mustang was patient. These tactics weren't without risk. Flak was thick around 262 bases. The Germans had figured out the Allied strategy and placed 88mm guns and light AA all around the perimeter. Sometimes the P-51s took heavy losses. But for every Mustang shot down, 2 or 3 jets were destroyed before they could become a threat. The Luftwaffe tried to adapt, moving jets between fields at night, using decoy airstrips, or launching from hidden taxiways. But it wasn't enough. The Allies had air superiority, radar coverage, and a fleet of fighters with the fuel and range to wait all day if they had to. In the skies, the German pilots tried to fight back, but they were few and stretched thin. By early 1945, the Luftwaffe was hemorrhaging talent. Many of the experienced aces were already gone, lost over Stalingrad, Italy, or Normandy. The 262 was now being flown by rushed cadets, some with barely 20 hours in jets. Others were veterans pulled from retirement and struggling to adapt to the jet's quirks. Combine that with fuel shortages, inadequate maintenance, and relentless bombing, and the result was predictable. Crashes on takeoff. Engine failures. Inexperienced pilots misjudging speeds and ripping off landing gear. For every Me-262 that made it into the sky, 2 never did. And the ones that did fly, found themselves hunted by a different kind of enemy. The P-51 wasn't just a fighter. It was a symbol of Allied strategy, speed, range, and relentless pressure. Its laminar flow wings and Packard-built Merlin engine gave it the legs to loiter, the power to climb, and the agility to dogfight when needed. It couldn't match a jet for top speed, but it didn't need to. It just had to be where the jets weren't ready. And that's exactly where it was. Sometimes, Mustang pilots didn't even wait for takeoff. They strafed runways, bombed hangars, and peppered parked aircraft with .50 caliber fire until the base was reduced to smoke and scrap metal. On one raid in March 1945, the 8th Air Force destroyed 27 Me-262s on the ground in a single day. Not a single one had the chance to fight back. It was air dominance by subtraction. And yet, for all their technical superiority, the jets kept flying, just enough to remind everyone they were still a threat. On April 7, 1945, the Luftwaffe launched a final major sortie with Me-262s, Operation Bodenplatz Bitte Echo. Nearly 60 jets attacked a massive formation of Allied bombers over Berlin. They shot down 25 aircraft in under 15 minutes. But 27 Me-262s were lost, most to Mustangs waiting for them on the egress route. It was, as one pilot later called it, a suicide sprint. By then, the war was already lost. Hitler was trapped in his bunker. German industry was crumbling. And still, the jets launched, fewer and fewer each week, but always with the same goal, to slow the inevitable. The Messerschmitt 262 had been a promise, a glimpse at what air combat would become. But it had arrived too late, in too few numbers, crippled by political interference and a crumbling war machine. In a different timeline, it might have changed everything. But in this one, it became the final gasp of a fading empire, hunted by the very aircraft that defined the war it tried to end. For the men flying them, the Messerschmitt 262 wasn't just another warplane. It was a taste of the future, a machine that belonged not in the burning skies of 1945, but in some cold, distant conflict still decades away. Even the pilots who watched their comrades die inside one knew they were part of something different. It didn't feel like flying. It felt like launching. Takeoff wasn't a roll, it was a push. That acceleration, the whine of the turbines, the sensation of leaving the others behind, it was intoxicating. And yet, it was an addiction laced with doom. By the final weeks of the war, the Me-262 was practically running on fumes, literally. Germany's synthetic fuel plants had been bombed to dust. What kerosene remained was siphoned from civilian stocks, stolen from grounded Heinkels, or shipped in armored convoys under heavy guard. Entire Luftwaffe squadrons sat idle so that a single staffel of jets could fly one more mission. Even then, half of them didn't make it home. Pilots were warned, if the engine flamed out, don't eject. Try to glide. Try to belly land. Try anything. But most didn't make it back. Crashed on roads. In rivers. Against trees. Jet wreckage littered Germany like a broken prophecy. Still, the Allies were watching. Closely. Every jet shot down was photographed. Every engine that survived was crated and shipped back to Dayton, to Farnborough, to Wright Field. British and American engineers picked them apart like surgeons. The swept wings. The engine intakes. The rudder balance. The materials. Nothing was wasted. The Me-262 was dead, but its skeleton was about to reshape the world. In the United States, test pilots at Muroc, later Edwards Air Force Base, flew captured 262s under the desert sun, studying how it handled at high speed. They discovered it could compress air so hard against its wings that it threatened to shatter itself in dives. They learned how to ease the throttle, how to climb in arcs, how to recover from stalls at jet speeds. Chuck Yeager would later say that studying the Me-262 helped him understand what would be needed to break the sound barrier. It wasn't a training tool. It was a warning, this is what comes next. In the Soviet Union, it was even more direct. The Germans left behind entire production lines. At the end of the war, Stalin's engineers found crates of jet parts, blueprints, fuselages, and intact Jumo engines. Within months, they reverse-engineered the design into their first native jet fighter, the MiG-9. It wasn't long before that evolved into the MiG-15. And from there, into the Cold War. The Americans responded with the F-86 Sabre. If you look at the two side by side, MiG-15 and F-86, you can trace the bones of the Me-262 in both. The same swept wings. The same tailplane design. The same focus on speed over turning. These weren't piston fighters anymore. These were missiles with cockpits. Dogfighting had gone supersonic. And it all started with a German jet the world wasn't ready for. But perhaps the most ironic part? The Me-262 never got the chance to do what it was designed for. Not really. It was supposed to be an interceptor, a bomber killer, a sky-clearing assassin. But most of its missions became last stands, desperate stabs at overwhelming odds. It had no radar, no long-range communication, no tactical flexibility. It couldn't escort. It couldn't patrol. It couldn't refuel. It was a scalpel used like a hammer. And the man who insisted on turning it into a bomber, Hitler, had no understanding of what he'd crippled. Historians still debate whether the Me-262 could have changed the course of the war had it been deployed sooner. Some say yes, if it had entered service in 1943, in numbers, with trained pilots, it could have decimated Allied bomber streams before they established air superiority. Others argue it wouldn't have mattered. The Allies had more factories, more fuel, more men, and radar that was improving by the week. The jet might have delayed the inevitable, but it wouldn't have stopped it. What's certain is that the Me-262 haunted Allied planners long after the war ended. It was the proof that technology could leapfrog strategy. That a single design breakthrough could nullify years of tactical doctrine. That's why, in the late 1940s, billions were poured into jet propulsion, high-speed aerodynamics, and guided weapons. Not because the Allies had succeeded, but because they had nearly failed. Today, only a handful of Me-262s remain. Some are museum pieces. Others are flying replicas, rebuilt with modern engines for demonstration flights. But even now, when one lifts off, spectators go quiet. There's something about the shape, the sound, the shimmer of heat behind the engines. It doesn't feel vintage. It feels like something still dangerous. Still not fully tamed. That's the legacy of the Me-262. Not its kill count. Not its victories. But its shadow. It was the first glimpse of what air combat would become, fast, unforgiving, shaped by physics more than flesh. And though it arrived too late to save the Reich, it arrived just in time to terrify the world into racing toward its future. For every minute the Me-262 soared through the sky, it cast an hour of doubt across the minds of Allied crews. By the winter of 1945, it wasn't just a fighter jet, it was a symbol. Of what Germany could have been. Of what the Allies had nearly missed. And of what might still be hiding in the shadows of a desperate Reich. Rumors spread faster than reports. Some bomber crews believed the Germans had hundreds of the jets hidden underground, waiting for a counterattack. Others thought they were invisible to radar. Invulnerable to bullets. Pilots who had never seen one in combat still scanned the horizon with clenched jaws, imagining silver shapes streaking toward them out of nowhere. This was psychological warfare at its most insidious. The Me-262 didn't have to win the skies. It just had to make the men flying into them second-guess everything. Allied fighter groups began adjusting tactics based on what a 262 might do, even when none were present. Bomber formations tightened. Mustang escorts flew higher and further out. Fuel was burned, time was wasted, nerves were frayed. The threat of the jet, real or imagined, forced a shift in how the air war was fought. And the Luftwaffe knew it. They exploited it. When a few jets were available, they launched them in pairs, sometimes even solo, just to scatter bomber formations. The jet would make a single, high-speed pass, disappear into cloud cover, and vanish. No kill. No confirmation. But the formation would fall apart. Tail gunners would empty their belts into shadows. Radio chatter would spike. Discipline would crumble. It was like lighting a match and walking away, watching the panic smolder from a distance. Allied commanders began to understand that fear alone was enough to weaken their grip on the skies. And that realization led to something darker. If the Me-262 was a symbol, it had to be destroyed as one. Not just shot down, but humiliated. Rendered ineffective. Shown to be mortal. The P-51 was the chosen tool. It was everything the 262 wasn't: reliable, agile, fuel efficient, and plentiful. And most importantly, It had become the face of Allied air dominance. Where the German jet symbolized breakthrough, the Mustang symbolized inevitability. So the strategy shifted. From countering the jet's speed to exploiting its limitations. Mustang squadrons were briefed on the enemy's most vulnerable moments, taxiing, climbing, landing. They studied base layouts from reconnaissance photos. They memorized the sightlines from runways to forests. They didn't want to meet the 262 in the air anymore. They wanted to catch it at the edge of its power. Grounded. Cornered. And it worked. One Mustang group, the famed 357th Fighter Group, began using dive traps, flying just out of sight, above cloud banks near known jet bases, then plummeting in coordinated attacks when the silver dots appeared below. The results were brutal. Not just destroyed jets, but demoralized ground crews, shattered infrastructure, and surviving German pilots who returned to empty hangars and dead friends. The message was clear: you may have the future, but we own the present. There were also victories that went unrecorded, psychological ones. Days when no Me-262s flew at all, because they couldn't risk it. Because the Allies had turned their airfields into death traps. Because the few pilots left refused to be sent up as sacrifices. And because the skies were so thoroughly owned by P-51s that the only thing faster than the German jets was the certainty of their destruction. But the most haunting victories were the ones that played out on the ground, in the minds of the men who once believed in the miracle of the jet. Engineers who saw their factories bombed to rubble. Test pilots who watched their friends flame out after takeoff. Air commanders who once called the 262 the Storm Eagle, now begged for spare parts, praying just 2 or 3 aircraft might make it airborne before dusk. And when they didn't, when silence hung over the runways at dusk, the truth became harder to deny. The Me-262 had been a psychological weapon. But the psychology had turned. It now symbolized desperation. Waste. Hope misplaced in a machine that couldn't carry the weight of a dying war. And in the end, it wasn't destroyed in the skies, it was erased from the imagination. The Mustang didn't just kill it. It replaced it. In every victory roll, every dogfight won, every safe return to base with wings intact, the P-51 wrote over the story the Germans tried to tell. That innovation could not overcome organization. That technology alone couldn't save a crumbling regime. That no miracle weapon, no matter how fast, how powerful, how futuristic, could stand against a relentless, coordinated force that knew exactly how to exploit its weakness. Even as the fires of war cooled and Europe limped into uneasy peace, the Me-262 refused to vanish into history. It lingered, part myth, part cautionary tale, part blueprint for what was coming next. In the years that followed, books would call it the jet that could have won the war. Documentaries would replay grainy black and white footage of it streaking through the sky like a bullet forged in another dimension. Model kits flew off toy store shelves. And at airshows, when a replica lifted off, modified with modern engines, it screamed slightly off from the original, a hush would fall. Heads would turn. Cameras would rise. Because even decades later, the silhouette of the Me-262 still commanded reverence. But reverence is not reality. And myth has a way of obscuring the truth. Yes, the Me-262 was a technological leap. It was the first operational jet fighter in history, and in raw performance, on paper, it was unmatched. Its twin Junkers Jumo 004 engines gave it a blistering top speed of 540 miles per hour, outpacing every Allied fighter. Its 430 million Malawian Quachars 108 cannons could tear through bombers like paper. But for every advantage it held, there were a dozen flaws no textbook could romanticize. The engines had a lifespan of just 25 operational hours. Flameouts were common. Throttle too fast, and you'd stall. Throttle too slow, and you'd get caught. Maintenance crews struggled to keep them flying more than 2 sorties per week. Even the fuel required, diesel-based J2 kerosene, was in critically short supply as Germany's refineries crumbled under Allied bombing. Pilots were trained too quickly. Airfields were too exposed. Command structures too disorganized. The Me-262 was a Ferrari handed to a collapsing state with no roads left to drive on. And then there was Hitler. His insistence that the aircraft be used as a bomber, what he called a Blitz Bomber, delayed mass production and diverted critical resources. Engineers had to modify the jet midstream, adding bomb racks and changing balance. The result was a platform that was neither pure fighter nor true bomber. It could do both, but never optimally. By the time frontline commanders convinced Berlin to reverse the order and deploy it as a fighter again, the Allies had already adapted their tactics. The Mustang trap was in place. The window had closed. Still, the legacy of the 262 endured, and it did so because of what it represented, the raw, untamed power of innovation. It had no escort. No predecessors. No roadmap. It arrived like lightning. And for a few months, it terrified the most powerful air forces on Earth. That alone gave it immortality. Post-war, its DNA scattered into the jet age. In America, North American aviation's engineers borrowed elements from the 262 when sketching out the F-86 Sabre, particularly its swept-wing design and center-mounted intake. The Soviets dissected captured airframes to aid development of the MiG-15, the aircraft that would later clash with Sabres in the skies over Korea. Even Britain's Gloucester Meteor, while developed independently, gained comparative insights by studying the German jet's combat data. But no country sought to truly copy the Me-262. Because in the end, it wasn't a finished idea. It was a glimpse. A prototype for a future that needed more time, more stability, more support. It taught the world not just what to build, but how not to build it. Don't rush. Don't politicize. Don't bet everything on a miracle. And yet, the jet refused to die. In 2002, a group of aviation enthusiasts and engineers under the Messerschmitt Foundation completed the world's first flying replica of the Me-262 using original blueprints and restored parts. It flew, as sleek and unsettling as ever. A ghost reborn. Crowds watched in silence. Veterans wept. For them, it wasn't nostalgia. It was memory made mechanical. The roar of turbines was the echo of a war that never really ended, just changed shape. Today, the Me-262 lives in museums and documentaries, in whispered, what ifs, and animated recreations on YouTube watched by millions. It's studied not just for its design, but for what it reveals about human ambition under pressure. About innovation born in desperation. About how one machine, faster, deadlier, stranger than anything that came before, could embody both brilliance and failure in equal measure. It did not win the war. But it made everyone rethink what war could become. That is why it matters. That is why we remember. Because sometimes, the machines that don't save a nation end up shaping the next century. And the Messerschmitt 262, with all its flaws and fury, did exactly that.